is my kind of boat. To my mind, the Dragon is one of the most beautiful yachts ever built. Sleek and beautifully proportioned. It's the kind of boat that men leave their wives for. But you don't have to start life with the Dragon. These mirror dinghies, there are over 18,000 of them, are just about the best introduction to sailing that there is. They cost £80 in kit form, and you can put it on top of your car.
The 1960s saw an extraordinary revolution in sailing. Plywood and plastic transformed the economics of getting on the water and staying there. The new weekend sailors in their small dinghies might look as if they were messing about in boats, but they were also dreaming of ocean-going adventures, emulating the new heroes that the decade produced. Men like the lone yachtsman Sir Francis Chichester. Chichester sailed into the record books and the nation's affection. Then an unknown merchant seaman, Robin Knox Johnston, conquered the last great maritime challenge by circumnavigating the globe, non-stop, alone. Until the late 1950s, sailing was the preserve of gentlemen. Gentlemen who had their yachts and their suits expensively tailored to their particular needs. The Cowes Regatta was just another whirl in the social carousel, a place to see and be seen. But the winds of change were blowing.
Can they be built even by people who have not much skill with tools?
Oh yes. In the 4 centres which the London County Council run in their evening institutes, we've had men with no previous experience at all of woodwork who've turned out very, very satisfactory jobs.
What could it cost a man to build his own boat?
Well, a small 7'9" sailing dinghy would cost him about £25, including the sails. But of course, if he was ambitious and wanted something like this Flying Dutchman, which is the new Olympic boat, it would cost him about £200.
The revolution in sailing came about really in the late 50s and early 60s with the do-it-yourself boom, and this came as a direct result of adhesive technology which brought cheap and waterproof plywood. No longer was it ever going to be just the preserve of the very rich. Very soon, everybody who wanted a boat was doing it that way. It was the development of adhesives during the war for aeroplane building as much as anything else.
The Mosquito bomber revolutionized plane construction and created new technologies, particularly in the glues, developed to be strong and waterproof.
Away from the assembly lines of metal giants, carpenters and cabinet makers are working on something new, the plywood Mosquito, with the speed of a fighter and the range and load of a bomber. These will also be the eyes of our new force.
By the 60s, we had more money and more leisure. Every bank holiday seemed to be one long queue for the coast, with the many watching the few. The unlikely offspring of the Mosquito bomber was the mirror dinghy. 11 feet of plywood, sponsored by the red-top Daily Mirror, it symbolized the new democratic age. Even the sails were red.
Don't turn around, 'cause I'll be near. When you want my love, baby. Well, I'm offering you a diamond ring.
Harold Macmillan told us we'd never had it so good. We may have wanted money, but plywood and glue meant we didn't need so much of it. And who was better with wood and glue than anyone else? Barry Bucknell.
Hello. Well, this week, 1 or 2 jobs that you might have to do on doors. I don't know whether you've got a problem like this, a rather ugly old panel door. It's one that can be solved quite simply. You can make it look like this.
The kits, jointly designed by Barry Bucknell and boat designer Jack Holt, were cut, drilled and packed ready for home assembly. The building technique was elegantly simple. The plywood panels were held together by copper wire to create a boat shape, and this was then glued to produce the ideal family boat, easy to sail and fun to race. The flat pack was designed to go through a standard doorway. DIYers who had fitted their kitchens and flush-panelled their lovely doors were now recruited to the flat pack flotilla. Barry, now in his 90s, is still a keen sailor and remembers well his most famous creation, the mirror dinghy.
I was very much interested in what people could do themselves. It was a revolution in bringing sailing to everyone, because it had, to some extent, a rich man's pastime.
The mirror was an exceptional concept because it was a true do-it-yourself boat, and I think it was £100 originally, and a big flat pack would arrive at your door with everything in it but the paint. That's what the advert said. The idea, I think, was if you could put up a shelf, you could build a mirror dinghy.
A small group of us once built one in a fourth-floor flat in Clanricarde Gardens in Notting Hill, and I can tell you that was done over a weekend, so they were relatively easy to build. The mirror dinghy just was enormous fun for a lot of people who'd never ever seen the water before, and never even thought to go on the water before, and many people built them and then found themselves with boats and had to learn to sail, and that was enormous fun because they were going out and doing it, and not doing it as people go and learn to sail today. They were just getting in their boats and finding out the hard way by experience.
Everywhere, on the coast and on reservoirs, flat-capped clubs sprang up for the new stitch and glue sailors. Keyhaven on the Solent encouraged the new sailors. In the 60s, annual subscriptions were only £5 for husband and wife. But such was the demand, clubs like Keyhaven were soon forced to close their doors to newcomers.
It was a wonderful era because the amount of boats that were being built was obviously reflected in the number of boats that one saw sailing, and you saw them sailing everywhere. No matter where you went, there were rivers or gravel pits or lakes where boats were sailing, even inland, and then all around the coast there were more. The ubiquitous mirror with its red sails was pretty evident everywhere you went. But not only that, there were the blue sails of the Enterprise, a boat which was put together by Jack Holt for another newspaper, the News Chronicle.
In the 60s, there was one man who aroused media attention and inspired the new breed of navigators. He was a middle-aged map and bookseller, Francis Chichester, who, suffering from cancer, decided to race single-handed across the Atlantic for a bet of £half a crown. He won and became sailing's new hero.
In June 1960, he and 4 other competitors set sail for New York. At 58, he was the old man of the race. For nearly 2 weeks, there was no sign of any of them. Each took a different route, southerly, hoping for trade winds, or northerly by the shortest route. Their radio sets were limited in range, and it wasn't until his 27th day at sea that Francis contacted Cape Race in Newfoundland. For days, we searched the seas around Long Island, and then on the 40th day, he was there, the winner.
You get a chance of getting absolutely down to the bedrock of the things that matter in life.
It was an achievement that Chichester made the start line at all. At Brompton Chest Hospital, he'd been diagnosed with lung cancer.
He was very ill indeed. Very ill. And I know a lot of people thought he wasn't going to get well, but I was quite convinced he would. Well, but he was extremely ill. I always consider that I saved his life then. He was very down, and I wouldn't let him have an operation, which would have been very dangerous for him, in my opinion. And he gradually, it took him about a year, and he gradually built up. And then he saw about this single-handed race, and I think it was a natural outcome. And I knew by instinct that this was what he needed and that he must go on it and it would be the cure for him, which it was.
Chichester's single-minded determination inspired sailors or would-be sailors of all ages. In all revolutions, it's important to catch them young. Blue Peter caught them early, just after school, in fact.
I've come down to the Essex Marina on the River Crouch to meet Bob Fisher. Bob is the world champion fireball and hornet sailor, and Bob's going to give me a few more helpful tips. Hi, Bob. How are you? I'm ready. I've got my life jacket on. Shall we go?
Yes, come aboard.
Which side?
If you'd like to sit on the port side,
yes,
that's the other side, the left-hand side.
Thank you.
And put a little centerboard down.
That's this?
Yes. Bring
This
it
way?
aft. Yes. Just pull it aft. That's it. Fine. Right. Ready? Now, if you'd like to pull on this starboard jib sheet to back the jib to carry the head round, I'll push off.
I noticed Bob using a paddle to help push us away from the quay. A paddle is essential equipment on a sailing boat because if the wind drops completely, you can still paddle your way home.
Minding my head as I go.
That's right. Sit down on this.
I was working at the BBC at the time when a call came through from Gil Riley in Blue Peter. Gil I knew quite well because she sailed at Burnham-on-Crouch and I'd been racing there over the years, and Gil asked me if I would teach Valerie Singleton to sail for Blue Peter, and the answer was inevitably yes, of course. And it was set up with an enterprise at Wallasey Marina on the River Crouch, and we based ourselves there and spent a day teaching Val to sail. She was an apt and willing pupil.
Jibo! Boom coming over. Mind your head. Lovely.
Jibing can be very tricky if there's anything of a wind blowing, because if you're not quick enough at rebalancing the boat, you'll capsize.
With the growing sport fast becoming big business, it wouldn't be long before BBC Two's money programme came on board.
Ocean racing has been likened to tearing up fivers under a cold shower. But there are some boats on which it's more like tearing up tenants. The days when sailing was the rich man's privilege, however, are over. Today, money merely means the difference between exclusiveness and mass production. Along with his children, the man in the street is beginning to find his sea legs. In the process, the sailing industry is on the crest of a wave of demand, which amounted last year to a turnover of £1 million a week. But this large, fragmented industry frequently runs aground on price, quality and efficiency.
The standard of fittings made today, with very few exceptions, I think are absolutely appalling. They completely appall me. They're badly designed, badly made. The distribution through factors and this sort of thing is appalling. In no other industry would this be allowed. The motor trade, who I've been associated with for many years, would never tolerate this sort of behaviour. They couldn't afford to tolerate it, but couldn't earn a living. I wonder how people in the industry even earn a living.
Most family dinghies don't cost more than £500, and that's quite enough. But if you really want to make a fool of yourself, just hop on a 16-foot fireball in a Force 8 and watch the water smoke. The helmsman here is a young athletic chap called Robin Bromley Martin, who built the boat. His crew, myself, is a middle-aged, overweight chap whose job is to clamber out on a trapeze with the general idea of keeping the boat upright. I said the general idea of keeping it upright. The point about Bromley Martin is that he's fit, but he's not getting much backup. The ridiculous thing about these murderous machines is that they cost anything up to £800. They're tremendously exciting for the young and skillful, but terrifying for the old and ham-fisted. That's why I gave up and, like the pound, decided to float.
Plywood had produced cheap, affordable dinghies. Now plastic, glass fibre, was doing the same for small cruisers. And they all looked just the same. Fiberglass moulds meant mass production. Cheaper boats meant more boats. More boats meant more problems. Whole stretches of the coast soon resembled floating caravan parks. The boat interiors had already started to resemble caravan designs in a conscious attempt to lure the weekender afloat. The home comforts were there for a life on the water, but there seemed ever less sea to live it on.
The problem was one of where to park them. Moorings were available initially, but they soon ran out of moorings because there was this vast rash of new boats coming onto the market, and people just swamped the available spaces.
With the rapid increase in the number of boats afloat and more inexperienced crews, the BBC stepped in again to provide much-needed instruction.
If he goes overboard here, yell, "Man overboard." Always reef early, because if you don't, the difficulties increase alarmingly. Many people don't seem to realize that the pressure on the sail varies as the square of the wind speed. For example, if the wind speed doubles, the resulting pressure on the sail is 4 times what it was before. This crew is obviously having some difficulty. There should be no need to have 3 men on the foredeck. But if your boat is well reefed, like this one in a 4-7, there's no need to worry about your safety. So I can't make any guarantees for your stomachs.
For one man, the most experienced of ocean sailors, the problems of the shore were problems he was destined to leave behind. Chichester realized that his chances of winning another transatlantic race were receding. So, at the age of 64, he decided to emulate the voyages of the clipper ships to Australia and back, round the Horn. He methodically studied the designs of model yachts and their self-steering gear. Copying and improving, he didn't stop until he'd developed a self-steering system fit to take him around the world alone. With his cancer in remission, he launched his new boat, Gypsy Moth the Fourth.
Northwest 5 or 6, moderating 3.
He was 64 when he sailed from Plymouth, indeed only 1 month away from becoming an old age pensioner.
Francis Chichester was really a remarkable man. He had a determination to succeed, like very few people have, I think. And he knew what he was tackling, and he knew how to tackle it, although he was entering what for any single-handed yachtsman were very strange waters. I mean, it's all right going down the Atlantic, that's not too bad, but when you turn a corner at Cape Town and start heading into the Southern Ocean, you meet some pretty fierce conditions.
Chichester's dogged determination got him as far as Australia, but the voyage had taken its toll on man and boat.
When he met the press, they could see what a solitary existence did to a man.
I think slowly, you see. One thing is being alone does do, what obviously is, makes you think very slowly. Now you made me spoil my train of thought. I wanted to say that about the loneliness. Yes, when you're...
When you're in a crisis.
Yes, when you're in a crisis, you see, you
said you're thinking very slowly. You lose touch with reality, in other words.
Yes, you're up against the real stark reality of life, really, life and death, let's put it that way. And you realize how much providence or back or...
Many people wondered as they watched this dramatic press conference whether Chichester would be able to leave for the second half of his journey. And perhaps this thought was in the minds of the press when they gave him the unusual honor of cheering. Meantime, alterations were being made to Gypsy Moth 4 before she faced Cape Horn.
Well, I'll certainly give it a good try. Fortunately for us, we can't look into the future, can we?
But first, the Tasman Sea and Cyclone Diana. It hit him before he had got his sea legs again, just at the time he was being violently seasick. A freak wave hit Gypsy Moth and turned her upside down. These were the conditions she'd been designed for, and she came up again, right side up. He went north about New Zealand, passing close to Lord Howe Island. Across the South Pacific he went towards Cape Horn. This is why the old clippers feared it so much. This was what they fought. And this is what Sir Francis fought. It was the one place in the world where he least expected to see another ship. But there was the Navy, in HMS Protector, watching him scud before the gale. On April the 11th, 1967, he crossed his outward track. It had taken him 6 months, 8 days, and 13.5 hours to circumnavigate the world. But still, there was the long haul home through the South Atlantic, across the equator and into the North Atlantic. Still, he pressed Gypsy Moth hard, racing her home. Now all Britain was waiting to welcome him home. It was, so the RAF said, good training practice for them to try and find him and plot his position. He and Gypsy Moth 4 had sailed 29,630 miles in 9 months and 1 day. And then he sailed up to Greenwich, where Queen Elizabeth II dubbed him Sir Francis, with the same sword that Queen Elizabeth I had used to touch the shoulder of Sir Francis Drake. For Gypsy Moth 4, there was to be no more sailing. She was laid alongside Cutty Sark in Greenwich, a museum piece of British sailing history.
While Chichester was braving the perils of the Southern Ocean, a young merchant seaman, Robin Knox Johnston, had arrived almost unnoticed in London after sailing his small 32-foot boat Suhaili back from his posting in India. His eyes were firmly set on the last great prize.
I started thinking about this round-the-world race when I read about Sir Francis Chichester going round. If you remember, he stopped once. This seemed to leave one thing to do, and that was to go round non-stop. I thought about it, and then I heard that a Frenchman was planning to build a boat which seemed to me to be very suitable for this. And knowing him, it seemed logical that he would go and do it. And I thought, well, it'd be much nicer if an Englishman did it first, so I planned to go.
In 1968, the Sunday Times got wind of a small number of sailors who were planning to make an attempt on the first non-stop passage alone around the world. The newspaper decided to turn the whole thing into a race that it would sponsor, the Golden Globe. The mastermind behind the Golden Globe race was the features editor, Ronald Hall.
It got the aspect of generally promoting the name of the Sunday Times to the public, but my main interest was to create a situation in which we were in the centre of good stories.
The Sunday Times offered 2 prizes, one for first home and one for the fastest. The rules were simple. Boats could start from any British port any time between June the 1st and October the 31st, 1968. Sailing had become a media event, and this race would give the press a story they'd never have imagined. There were only 9 entrants, and one of them was Robin Knox Johnston in Suhaili.
When I sailed, the full list of competitors hasn't been completed, so we didn't know who was going. Che, Blythe and Ridgway, I wasn't too worried about them. I felt they hadn't got much sailing experience and I'd probably catch them. The real one I thought was the competition was Bernard Matessier of France with Joshua. The multi-hulls, well, they were still sort of talking about it. I didn't think they'd get round somehow.
Multi-hulls were the new thing in the late 60s. Catamarans and trimarans were fast and exhilarating. They had their devotees, but they also had their detractors.
Recently, multi-hull cruisers have fallen under something of a cloud. In the last 3 years, there have been at least 12 serious accidents, and 2 of that select band of multi-hull designers, Arthur Piver and Hedley Nicholl, have been lost at sea in their own boats.
2 of the competitors, Commander Nigel Tetley and the Somerset businessman Donald Crowhurst, chose nearly identical Arthur Piver-designed plywood trimarans. Crowhurst ran a factory in Bridgewater, Somerset, and one of his most successful products, the Navigator, a radio direction finder, was aimed at the new breed of sailors. Success in a round-the-world race would promote this and his other nautical inventions.
Crowhurst had little or no money of his own to invest in a new boat. His own firm, Electron Utilization, was failing badly. It was to local caravan tycoon Stanley Best Crowhurst turned for money for a boat, with surprising success.
I'd been associated with Donald Crowhurst so far as financing him was concerned in his electronic business for a couple of years, and I was certain that there would be an immense benefit to that business if he was successful.
Stanley Best put up £9,000 to build the trimaran Crowhurst wanted, and work presided over by John Eastwood at Norfolk was soon underway. The boat was of standard design with sophisticated modifications by Crowhurst.
Anybody who undertakes any single-handed passage of any length without giving a great deal of thought to the hazards involved is running quite a lot of risk. The fact is that it is always possible to have an accident at sea. One should never lose sight of these risks, and one must do one's best to reduce the risk to a low and acceptable level, but you cannot possibly eliminate it.
Although, like Crowhurst, most of the competitors were sponsored, Knox Johnston was not. He faced a straight choice: either sit out the greatest sailing race ever, or start in Suhaili. Strong but small and slow, but at least the boat he knew. Having picked the Tortoise, he'd started as soon as he could on the 14th of June, but not without misgivings.
When I sailed, I was a very frightened man. I didn't know what the future held. I reckon there was a 60% chance of surviving. And obviously, I didn't want to die. But at the same time, I couldn't possibly turn back. I didn't want to turn back. So I had these sort of combination of forces, one driving me on and one saying, don't be a bloody fool, turn round now. Don't risk your life, it's not worth it. You've got 40, 50 years ahead. Don't throw it away.
We picked them up on July the 13th, and it's their first real crisis. Suhaili has sprung a leak in shark-infested waters, and the only solution is to go overside to patch it.
I wore a blue shirt and jeans while working, partly for warmth and partly for camouflage. I didn't want to resemble white decayed meat near the surface. 09:30, went overside to start caulking and tacked some tarred canvas over the seam. This took 2 hours because although I'd put tacks into the canvas, I could never really hammer home more than one before coming up for air. The biggest time waster was having to check round for sharks every minute. But a shark appeared. I hoped he would go away, but he kept circling round, and as this meant I could not safely work, I had to shoot him. I left an hour and a half and then went over to finish the job on the port side. This time I was not disturbed. 2 months at sea and I don't know where we are.
The difficulties faced by Knox Johnston and the other competitors show the differences between sailing alone then and now. The challenge of that race was immense. Navigation was by centuries-old sextant, measuring the angle of the sun or the stars and then using a mathematical table to plot positions on a chart.
They had none of the modern aids to navigation that we have now. Neither do they have the sophisticated equipment, either in clothing or in food.
Now, it's instantaneous. You've got modern navigation methods, you've got GPS, you can check your position every few minutes, as often as you like, and it's spot on within a few hundred yards. They send emails, they can talk to people anywhere in the world, so they don't feel they're cut off. But people like Knox Johnston, when he was away for over 300 days, for part of that voyage, we thought he'd lost for something like 14, 15 weeks. He was missing in the Southern Ocean, missing as far as we were concerned, because he just couldn't communicate. So they were very much alone. And that feeling of being totally cut off from the world must have made people quite desperate at times.
The Golden Globe would soon become a story of Knox Johnston, the experienced merchant sailor, and Crowhurst, the ambitious weekend sailor. While Knox Johnston was already experiencing the difficulties of solo navigation, Crowhurst had yet to set sail.
Crowhurst had expected to travel from Norfolk to Teignmouth in 3 days. In fact, the trip took 2 weeks. The worst of a number of problems was that the boat refused to head into the wind.
It took far longer for you to come round from the east coast than you had originally planned. Now, what sort of pressures has this put on you as a result?
Oh, it's a week less. Means less time, you know. Schedule that much tighter.
Crowhurst could still smile in front of the cameras, but his situation was desperate.
On the last day allowed, he sailed. His lines were tangled and essential stores had been mistakenly left ashore. When he should have turned back, he decided to go on. With a radical trimaran designed by the ill-fated Arthur Piver, Crowhurst sailed out of his adopted port of Teignmouth onto perhaps the most dramatic and controversial voyage of modern sailing history. The stress of sailing in an unfinished, untested and leaking boat put an unbearable strain on Donald Crowhurst. His reported positions soon became erratic. Meanwhile, Knox Johnston was facing his first crisis.
October the 13th. God must have been with us today. This has been the worst weather I've ever encountered. I gave up at one stage. I was looking for the morphine, thinking that if I did have to take to the life raft, I'd take that and make an easy end when the food ran out. Day succeeds weary day and gale succeeds gale. I'm getting thoroughly sick of it all. A prisoner at Dartmoor doesn't get hard labour like this. I wonder how the crime rate would be affected if people were sentenced to sail around the world alone instead of going to prison.
Throughout his journey at sea, Crowhurst shot film and made tape recordings for the BBC.
I have never put to sea in such a completely unprepared state in my life. Nevertheless, stipulations were that competitors would leave by the 31st, and leave by the 31st I did.
He also wrote voluminously in his logbooks. Read here by Michael Jaston.
November the 5th, Tuesday. Rachel's birthday. Happy birthday, Rachel. Hell of a morning for me, though. I was feeling pleased with myself when I noticed that bubbles were blowing out under the port forward hatch. All the evidence was that the compartment was full of water. I cursed the people who'd been kind enough to help me stow ship, and I cursed myself for a fool. I swore the boat was a toy, fit only for the Broads or the pool at Earl's Court.
In mid-Atlantic, Suhaili was taking a battering. Having lost his self-steering and his radio, and with polluted water and a leaking boat, Robin Knox-Johnston was still sailing on. But in the absence of reported sightings, many feared the worst.
She was seaworthy, but she was battered. I mean, she'd lost a lot of paint. This cabin had shifted and was leaking all round the edge. I'd lost the radio, lost my water. The main boom here had broken. I'd had to spend 2 days drilling through miles steel with a hand drill to create an inch diameter hole to make a new gooseneck. Not easy when the boat's rolling around. You tend to break drill bits and you've got no shops out there. Sails were, well, the mainsail was hand sewn by then. Started off machine stone, but I'd had to sew it every single inch of it during the course of the voyage. Mizzen wasn't much better. I'd lost a jib. Staysail was surviving. Rigging was okay, but I was getting short of rope, you know, to do repairs with. Engine had packed up quite early on. I had no engine. Generator was surviving, but it was normally a cylinder head off every time I wanted to use it and clean it up to make it work. So it took a long time to do. Structurally, there she was fine. But she did look a bit battered.
I feel I've done a reasonably good day's work today. Filming, recording, looking after the boat and navigation, cooking, and of course, by far the most important event, establishing my contact with Portishead Radio, which is the crowning achievement of today.
I was a radio officer at Portishead Radio during the time that Donald Crowhouse was supposed to be going around the world. I took a lot of messages from him, in Morse code, of course, because we were what we call a WT station, HFWT, high frequency wireless telegraphy. We made it past his signals to the various people, to his agent and also to his wife. We sat with earphones on, took our signals and typed them out. But with him, because he was a special case, we would perhaps type it out and take it up and phone it through to his wife.
It was a local story, and we were very much looking forward to getting frequent progress reports from heroic Crowhurst as he went around the world. This is what race entrants do. They're radioing back positions, what's happening to them. We got virtually nothing. At very long intervals, Donald would send back a 6-word telegram to Portishead Radio, which his agent didn't like because he wanted success stories to push on to us and to all the papers. So the agent had to do his best with 6 words, turn it into 40 words and hope that that was it. But we never really knew what he was doing. We never really knew where he was.
I was employed by the Sunday Times to follow the 10 contestants in the Round the World yacht race in 1968, and indeed to calculate their relative speeds each week in comparison with Chichester's famous voyage the previous year. Now, Donald Crowhurst, of course, was the last to leave on the 31st of October, and he did very, very poor speeds for the first week or two in what was generally rather poor weather. But what worried me about Donald Crowhurst was the vagueness of the information we got from him. And then suddenly, in early December, we had this claim for a world record for a single-handed yachtsman, 243 miles in one day. Well, that made me suspicious, bearing in mind he'd only been averaging 50 miles a day, roughly, up until that time.
This claim worried both Captain Rich and Francis Chichester. But the world continued to follow Crowhurst's progress unaware. It was only at the end of his voyage, which curiously lasted 243 days, that this message was seen as a turning point.
It was at that particular stage that things started to change, and indeed when I reconstructed his route sometime later, once the logbooks had been brought back to the United Kingdom, in fact it was from that period on that we had two voyages, if you like. The real voyage, which took him down to the Falklands roughly and back again, and the fraudulent voyage, which indeed he pretended to go around the world.
The pressures on Crowhurst were now building, with tragic consequences. On his one real voyage, Knox Johnston had crossed the equator, homeward bound.
April the 12th, I was sitting quietly steering when, dancing astern, I saw a ship coming up. I hoisted my signal letters and got out the orders. I received, "What do you want?" And I sent back, "I am non-stop round the world reported missing."
There he is. Look at the smile. Look at the smile on the face of the man who's coming in to take that prize. He really is enjoying this. This is tremendous.
Knox Johnston had circled the globe at walking pace, but he'd achieved what he'd intended 10 months earlier. He was the first man to circumnavigate the world non-stop, alone.
Well, I could have finished about 8 in the morning, but I was asked to slow up because the mayoress was getting her hair done and couldn't greet me before 10, so they said slow up, you know, so that the mayor can be there to greet you. So I slowed up and the wind changed and came in from the north, and it was quite strong. And I thought, well, I'm not going to break anything now. So I didn't have too much sail up.
It's a remarkably keen. He's got some plenty of barnacles down near the stern. I hope we're going to move on.
I think you may well be in danger of getting a greeting from him, Sir Francis.
Yeah, I think we're going to get in contact with him.
And as he made his way into Falmouth, there was Sir Francis Chichester, his hero and chairman of the race judges, to greet him. Sir Francis was close by on the BBC launch. Too close.
Just about, yes. You were saying about disqualification. We lost
The BBC boat did bang into me. Didn't do any damage. But it was, you know, they weren't watching. And I thought, that's a professional boatman, and he's not watching what he's doing. What are these others like? So I was really concerned about someone damaging my boat right at the end. So I was much more concerned about that than anything else.
The cannon has gone. The hooters, the horns, the salute. Day 312, about 25 past 3 on April the 22nd, and Robin Knox Johnston and Sue Haley have sailed non-stop around the world.
The papers got one thing badly wrong. All the sailors wanted to be first. Being fastest was runner-up, consolation prize. Didn't matter. Once I finished and took the Golden Globe, inevitably, there'd be no build-up to that because I just suddenly appeared. Inevitably, they're going to build up the fastest business.
There were still two boats, the nearly identical Piver trimarans, at sea. One must win the £5,000 for the fastest passage. But one of the trimarans, Tenmouth Electron, had already attracted the attention of Craig Rich, navigational consultant to the Sunday Times.
We would get messages, and we one in particular off the Cape of Good Hope, been through some rough seas. One of the floats is damaged, got water in it, the generator's damaged. I'm not going to be able to use the generator, therefore I shall be out of radio contact going around the Roaring Forties. So I then calculated when at his average speed he would get to Cape Horn. He turned up 3 weeks early, suddenly, just off Cape Horn. Now that didn't ring true.
Then, when he was pressing hard, disaster struck Lieutenant Commander Nigel Tetley.
I think the real tragedy that Donald Crowhurst caused was in pressurising Nigel Tetley, who was going around in another trimaran. And Tetley, hearing on the very few radio contacts he had where Crowhurst had positioned himself to his sponsors and to the press, that he was under pressure to go faster, and he pushed his boat so hard that it eventually broke up. Otherwise, he would have been the first man to have sailed round the world single-handed in a multi-hull, and that would have been a magnificent achievement. And he lived to regret that for the rest of his life and eventually took his own life.
I was proved totally wrong by Tetley, who really performed an amazing achievement just about making it home. That was something that I think he failed to get the recognition he deserved for that voyage.
This left Donald Crowhurst certain to win the £5,000, yet fate had one card left to play. Sir Francis had been suspicious of Crowhurst almost from the beginning. He contacted the Sunday Times, drawing attention to the apparent inconsistencies of the voyage. Crowhurst had indeed faked his voyage, though probably not to win the prize.
Crowhurst didn't actually want to win. His plan, I think, was to come second. If he'd come second, he wouldn't have won anything. He wouldn't have won the £5,000, which was a lot of money in those days. He wouldn't have won the Golden Globe. The chances are his logbooks wouldn't have been scrutinised. The winners would, though, without any question.
With Tetley out, he faced almost certain exposure. This realization took him beyond breaking point. Having carefully stacked his logbooks and charts, documents he knew would reveal the strange story of his last voyage, he disappeared. When the boat was found, ghosting along on a nearly flat sea, 2 radio sets were in pieces. Tufts of hair lay on the cabin floor, and a soldering iron lay balanced on a tin of powdered milk. Only 2 things were missing: Crowhurst and the ship's clock.
When we heard what had happened, my initial thought was that he'd probably gone up on deck to have a pee and fallen off. You know, it's easy enough to do. But later on, when the logs were examined, it was quite clear that wasn't the case. And one felt enormous sympathy for a person who got himself into the fix. I mean, he couldn't blame anyone else but himself. He's in charge of his destiny. It's up to him to say no. He didn't say no when he should have said no. He was looking around for someone else to say no for him, and therefore he felt pressured to go. He should have said no. But it was a tragedy, the way that developed.
The decade that had changed sailing forever finished with one of its greatest mysteries. Donald Crowhurst paid the ultimate price in seeking the greatest prize: to be the first man to sail non-stop around the world.
I think the 60s were the last time when real heroes were generated in sailing, because they were achieving what nobody else had done before. I mean, sailing around the world non-stop single-handed was very much like scaling Everest by Hillary and Tenzing. And nobody had ever done it before. Well, there are very few things you can do in sailing now that haven't been done before. I mean, one man has sailed around the globe 3 times non-stop. Where do you go from there?
La mer qu'on voit danser le long des golfes clairs.
Exploring another of the boats that built Britain here on BBC4 Tomorrow at 8:30. But back to tonight, and we're travelling Britain's coast with the nation's favourite choirmaster, digging out the shanties and sea songs that season our maritime history. Next.